Amelia Langford expected 3 silent hours on the night train to Washington, until 3 men stepped into the first-class car and looked at her the way a patient hunter studies something wounded. The only person seated beside her was Elijah Carter, a quiet black single father in a worn jacket, his eyes calm in a way that made him almost invisible. In a moment of desperation, Amelia leaned toward him and quietly whispered, "Be my husband for the next 3 hours." She had no idea that whisper had just woken a dangerous past Elijah spent years trying to bury. If you love a dangerous, fate-driven encounter between 2 guarded strangers, stay with this story all the way through. Amelia boarded the night train from New York bound for Washington, carrying a leather bag that seemed far too light for the weight of what it held. Inside, tucked beneath a folder of ordinary paperwork, sat a small data drive containing evidence that Mason Drake, the chief operating officer of Langford Biotech, had quietly diverted millions from a medical research fund meant for patients who could not afford treatment on their own. She had spent sleepless nights building the case, tracing shell accounts that led back to the same private ledger Mason thought no one would find. Tomorrow morning, she would present that evidence to a federal review board, and Mason would lose his position before lunch. She settled into her seat in the first-class car, arranging her coat and bag with the practiced efficiency of a woman who rarely allowed herself to rest. Beside her sat a man in a plain jacket, worn at the elbows, holding a paperback novel he did not seem to be reading so much as using as an excuse to keep his eyes lowered. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Elijah Carter, a soft-spoken railway technician who worked part-time shifts and spent the rest of his hours raising a young daughter alone. Amelia gave him the brief, dismissive glance she reserved for anyone she judged unlikely to matter to her evening, a glance that catalogued him as harmless and forgettable, and then she turned back to the window. The train pulled away from the platform, gathering speed through the tunnels beneath the city before breaking into open track in darkness. For the first 20 minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then 3 men entered the car in staggered succession, spaced far enough apart that a careless observer would never connect them, yet close enough in manner that Amelia felt something tighten low in her stomach the moment the third one passed. They did not sit. They lingered near the exits, near the aisle, near the small connecting door to the next car, each of them glancing toward her with the particular attention of men who already knew exactly who she was. Amelia reached for her phone to call her security detail, the 2 men who were supposed to be traveling 2 cars back, and found only silence on the line where a ringtone should have been. She tried again, her thumb steady even as her pulse was not, and the call failed a second time. A cold understanding moved through her, quiet and absolute, the understanding of a woman who has spent years learning to recognize when a room has changed around her. She was not simply being watched. She was being hunted, and whoever had arranged this had made certain she would arrive at that realization completely alone. She glanced sideways at the man beside her, the quiet stranger with the paperback, and something in his stillness caught her attention in a way it had not before. He was not fidgeting the way an ordinary passenger might in the presence of 3 unsettling men. He was watching, carefully, without appearing to watch at all, the way a person does when they have been trained to notice everything and reveal nothing. Amelia did not know why she trusted the instinct that rose in her chest at that moment, only that it arrived faster than her fear did, and it told her that the man beside her was the only steady thing left in the car. The nearest of the 3 men began to move down the aisle, slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Amelia with an expression that offered no room for negotiation. She felt the walls of the train car narrow around her, felt the full isolation of the open track outside the window, miles from any station, any help, any version of the life she had built for herself as a woman who answered to no one. In that single suspended second, instinct overtook strategy, and she leaned toward the stranger beside her and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Be my husband for the next 3 hours," she said, and she felt the words leave her like a confession she had never meant to make. The stranger turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting hers for the first time, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. Then, without a single question, he reached over and took her hand into his, the gesture so natural, so unhurried, that the three men down the aisle stopped where they stood, recalculating a situation that had just become far more complicated than they had planned for. Amelia Langford, who trusted almost no one, had just placed her safety into the hands of a man whose name she did not even know. Elijah slipped into the role with a fluency that startled Amelia far more than the danger itself. He shifted his posture, angled his shoulder just slightly to block the line of sight between her and the men near the aisle, and spoke her name as though he had known her for years, though of course she had never told it to him. She would later realize he had read it from the boarding pass tucked into the outer pocket of her bag, a small detail noticed and used in less than a second, the kind of observation that belonged to someone with far more training than a man in a worn jacket should have. In a low voice, barely moving her lips, Amelia tried to explain the situation as quickly as she could. She told him she believed the three men had been sent because of a corporate betrayal, a colleague who wanted her silenced before a meeting that could end his career. Elijah listened without interrupting, his gaze flicking once toward each man in turn, cataloging the earpiece barely visible beneath one man's collar, the practiced way another kept his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, the small coordinated glance that passed between them like a signal. "These are not opportunists," he said quietly, still holding her hand. "They are working from instructions." Amelia felt a fresh wave of fear at the calm certainty in his voice, the way he spoke about danger, the way other people spoke about weather. She asked if they should call the police the moment the train reached its next stop, and Elijah shook his head slowly, explaining that if someone inside her own company had orchestrated this, then whoever received that call might already be compromised, and any warning could simply accelerate what these men intended to do. Amelia studied him more closely then, searching his face for some explanation for the steadiness she found there. "Who are you?" she asked, and Elijah offered only a small, unreadable smile, saying he had spent some time doing security work, long ago, in a life that no longer resembled the one he lived now. It was not an answer, not really. But something in the honesty of his evasion made her believe him more than a full explanation would have. One of the three men, the tallest of them, began drifting closer under the pretense of asking whether she needed any assistance, his tone polite in a way that felt deliberately hollow. Elijah answered before Amelia could, introducing himself smoothly as her husband, his arms settling around her shoulders with unhurried confidence, creating a small wall of social expectation that the man had not planned for. The stranger hesitated, clearly recalculating, and retreated half a step, muttering an apology that convinced no one. Amelia exhaled slowly once he had moved away, feeling for the first time that the car had regained a small, fragile margin of safety. She reached for her phone again, intending to check the time, and felt a strange, ill-defined suspicion prickle at the back of her neck. When she unlocked the screen, she noticed her signal indicator behaving oddly, flickering between bars in a pattern that had nothing to do with the train's location. She showed it to Elijah without a word, and his expression, calm until that moment. "Someone is mirroring your signal," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the car once more, and Amelia felt the full weight of her situation settle over her, heavier than before. She was no longer simply being followed. She was being monitored in real time by people who had planned this with far more precision than a hurried, desperate scheme. As the train rattled onward into the dark countryside, Amelia understood that whatever these 3 hours were meant to be, they had already become something far more dangerous than the plea she had whispered only minutes before. The train left the last cluster of small-town lights behind and pushed into open darkness. And with the change in scenery came a change in the air of the car itself, a thinning of comfort that Amelia felt in her chest before she could name it. The signal on her phone dropped to nothing at all. The overhead lighting seemed dimmer than it had been an hour earlier, though nothing had technically changed, and the ordinary sounds of a night train, the low hum of wheels on rail, the distant clatter from the dining car, began to feel less like background noise and more like the walls of a room slowly closing in. Elijah rose first, suggesting in an easy, husbandly tone that they walk to the dining car for water, and Amelia followed his lead without hesitation, grateful for any excuse to move. As they passed through the connecting doors, he used the short walk to study each car they entered, noting exits, noting staff, noting the subtle absence of a particular conductor who should have made his rounds 20 minutes earlier and had not. In the dining car, he spotted a young attendant whose hands trembled faintly as she wiped down an already clean counter, her eyes darting too often toward the door, and Elijah recognized in her the unmistakable posture of someone who had been paid, or threatened, into cooperation. While they waited near the counter, Amelia finally told him the fuller shape of her situation, keeping her voice low. Mason Drake, her company's chief operating officer, wanted her to sign over operational control before the review board meeting the following morning. A legal maneuver that would allow him to bury the evidence of his theft before anyone with authority could examine it. If she refused, she suspected he intended to discredit her instead, perhaps permanently. Elijah listened, turning the pieces over in his mind, and offered a theory that chilled her far more than anything she had considered on her own. These men might not simply want the drive in her bag. They might want her to disappear entirely, or to be found in some scandal so complete that no one would ever believe her testimony again. She asked him, quietly, why he was helping her at all, a stranger who owed her nothing and who had far more to lose by drawing attention to himself than by simply staying out of it. Elijah looked at the counter for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter than before. He said only that he understood, more than most people could, what it felt like to have an entire system turn its back on you at once, and that he could not sit beside someone facing that and do nothing. Before Amelia could respond, her phone buzzed once in her pocket, and the screen lit with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered, and Mason Drake's voice slid smoothly through the speaker, calm and almost gentle, the voice he used in board meetings when he wanted to appear reasonable, while delivering something entirely unreasonable. He told her the situation had already gone further than she realized, and that whatever happened next was, in his words, simply a matter of time. Then, in a tone meant to unsettle her, he added a single line that made her blood run cold. Do not trust the man sitting beside you. Amelia lowered the phone slowly, her eyes rising to meet Elijah's, uncertainty flickering behind her carefully maintained composure for the first time since the journey began. Before either of them could speak again, another message arrived, this one an image, grainy and old, showing a younger version of Elijah in a formal uniform beneath a headline about an internal investigation and a dismissal for what the article called a serious breach of professional trust. Amelia stared at the screen, then at the man beside her, feeling the fragile trust she had built in the last hour begin to tremble under the weight of a past she did not yet understand. Amelia turned to face him fully, the image still glowing on her phone screen between them, and asked, without softening the question at all, who he really was. Elijah did not look away. For a moment he seemed to weigh how much of himself he was willing to hand over to a stranger he had known for barely an hour. And then, quietly, he began to speak. He told her he had once worked as a federal security investigator, assigned to protect corporate witnesses in cases involving fraud and internal corruption, work that required him to disappear into the background of other people's lives the way he had disappeared into hers on this train. Years earlier, he explained, he had uncovered evidence that a supervisor above him was accepting payoffs to bury cases before they reached prosecution. He reported it through the proper reporting line, trusting the system to protect the people who spoke up inside it. Instead, the system protected itself. Within months, falsified records appeared in his own file. His credibility was dismantled piece by piece, and he lost the career he had built over a decade in a matter of weeks. He did not elaborate much further, only saying, in a voice that carried no self-pity, that the fallout had cost him nearly everything, and that somewhere in the middle of losing his name, he had also become the only steady presence in the life of a small daughter who needed him far more than any job ever had. Amelia absorbed this in silence, feeling something shift inside her chest, a recognition she had not expected to find in a stranger from a train car. She had spent years learning to distrust nearly everyone around her, raised into a company empire after her father's early death, treated by the board as an heiress to manage rather than a leader to respect, forced to prove her competence over and over, simply to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who assumed she had inherited her position. Sitting beside Elijah, she realized she understood, for the first time in a long while, what it felt like to speak to someone who had also been underestimated by the very system meant to protect him. Outside the dining car, the situation continued to tighten. The three men had positioned themselves at each end of the connecting cars, effectively turning the train itself into a controlled corridor with no clear path to safety. Elijah noticed the pattern first, the way their positions had shifted to block both directions rather than simply watching from a distance, and he understood immediately what it meant. They were not planning to wait until Washington. They intended to force Amelia off the train at a smaller, unscheduled stop long before the city came into view, somewhere with fewer witnesses and no waiting security detail to interfere. He explained this to her plainly, without exaggeration, because he had learned long ago that softening a threat only made people slower to react to it. Amelia felt fear rise again, sharper this time, but beneath it she felt something new as well, a fragile thread of resolve forming where panic had been building only minutes earlier. Elijah told her that whatever happened next, he did not intend to let this end at some unnamed platform in the dark. He said it simply, without performance, the way a person states a fact rather than a promise. And somehow, that made Amelia believe him more completely than any grand assurance could have. For the first time since boarding the train, Amelia found herself trusting a stranger more than the security team she had paid to protect her, more than the executive she worked beside every day, more than the company she had spent her whole adult life defending. She did not know yet how far that trust would be tested before sunrise, only that the quiet, unassuming man beside her had become, without either of them intending it, the only certainty left in a night that had turned into something far more dangerous than a routine ride to Washington. Elijah guided Amelia further into the dining car under the pretense of searching for a working security camera, something that might record whatever happened next and give them leverage if things escalated. He moved without hurry, scanning the ceiling corners, the mirrored panel near the register, the small dark lens above the emergency exit sign, cataloging each one with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years assessing rooms for exactly this kind of vulnerability. Amelia stayed close beside him, doing her best to appear like a woman simply accompanying her husband on an ordinary errand, rather than a target counting down the minutes until danger found her again. It did not take long. The tallest of the three men, the one who called himself Logan Pierce, sauntered toward them with a slow, deliberate swagger, his eyes moving over Elijah with open contempt. He made a remark about the kind of man who ends up married to someone like Amelia, his words dripping with the particular cruelty of someone who assumed skin color and a worn jacket meant a person could be dismissed without consequence. Elijah did not react to the insult at all. His face remained perfectly calm, his eyes tracking instead the position of Logan's hands, the shift of his weight, the shallow rhythm of his breathing, reading him the way he might read a case file rather than a person trying to provoke him. Behind them, a second man, Carter Wells, moved with practiced casualness toward Amelia's bag, his fingers brushing the strap as though by accident. Before Amelia even registered the motion, Elijah's hand closed around Carter's wrist in a small, contained movement that barely disturbed the air around them, applying just enough pressure to make the other man freeze without drawing the attention of the handful of passengers still scattered through the car. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like nothing more than an accidental collision between two travelers reaching for the same handrail. Amelia felt her pulse hammering as she watched the exchange, stunned by how quietly Elijah had neutralized a threat that could easily have become violent in seconds. There was no display of force, no raised voice, nothing that would have alerted the rest of the car to how close danger had actually come. It was the second time that night. Amelia felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of who this man truly was, and it would not be the last. The third man, Jason Reed, chose that exact moment to trigger a small commotion near the emergency panel, setting off a sudden shrill alarm that sent a ripple of confusion through the car. Passengers rose from their seats. Staff hurried forward in alarm, and for several seconds the dining car dissolved into precisely the kind of chaos that made careful observation impossible. Elijah's attention split instantly between protecting Amelia and tracking the three men, and in that narrow window of confusion, someone brushed past her from behind, quick and practiced, gone before she even felt the contact. It was only once the alarm silenced and the car settled back into uneasy stillness that Amelia noticed something wrong. Her bag felt lighter than it should have. The balance shifted in a way she might never have registered if she had not spent the last several hours acutely aware of every ounce it carried. Elijah noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the strap resting against her shoulder. Amelia unzipped the bag with trembling fingers, sifting quickly through the folder of paperwork, the small cosmetics case, the charging cable coiled at the bottom, until her hand found only empty space where the data drive should have been. She looked up at Elijah, her expression hollowed by disbelief, and said the only words that mattered in that moment. "It is gone." For a moment, Amelia felt something close to collapse, the careful composure she had maintained her entire professional life, threatening to give way all at once. Every transfer she had traced, every late night spent building an airtight case against Mason Drake, every ounce of proof that could hold him accountable had existed on that single drive. And now it was gone, carried away by hands she had not even seen. She pressed her palm flat against the counter to steady herself, and Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but firm, cutting through the rising panic before it could take hold of her completely. He told her to think, not to fall apart. Whoever had taken the drive would not destroy it immediately, not if their plan involved using it as leverage against her, and that fact alone meant there was still time to act. Amelia forced herself to breathe, to lean, however reluctantly, on the calm certainty in his tone rather than the fear clawing at her own thoughts. Elijah guided her quietly toward a narrow technical corridor near the rear of the dining car, a space reserved for staff, where he pulled up a small folded map of the train's layout from a maintenance panel, tracing the cars with one finger as he worked through possibilities aloud. While he studied the layout, Amelia found herself speaking more openly than she had intended, the adrenaline of the last hour loosening something she usually kept locked tightly away. She told him about her father, about the sudden loss that placed her at the head of Langford Biotech before she felt ready for any of it, about the board members who had spent years testing her decisions more harshly than they ever tested her father's, waiting for her to prove she deserved the seat rather than assuming she already had. She admitted quietly that she had built an entire identity around never needing anyone, because needing someone had always seemed like handing them the exact weapon they would eventually use against her. Elijah listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said something simple, without any attempt to comfort her beyond honesty. Strength, he told her, was not always about standing alone. Sometimes it was about recognizing the moment when standing alone stopped being wisdom and started being isolation. Amelia looked at him for a long moment, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere she had not expected to let it reach. Her phone buzzed again before she could respond, Mason's name flashing once more across the screen. This time his tone had lost its earlier smoothness, replaced by something colder and more urgent. He gave her 20 minutes to sign the digital transfer of operational authority he had already prepared, warning that if she refused, he would release fabricated evidence claiming she had personally diverted funds meant for patient care. Evidence detailed enough, he assured her, to end her career and her reputation within a single news cycle. Amelia's hands tightened around the phone, fury and fear tangled together in a way she had rarely allowed herself to feel so openly in front of another person. Elijah's attention sharpened as he finished tracing the last car on the map, his finger stopping on a small locked compartment marked for secured baggage. If someone wanted to hold on to stolen evidence without letting it out of their control, that was exactly the kind of space they would use. Isolated, monitored only by a single access code, far enough from the main cars to avoid casual witnesses. He looked up at Amelia, his expression steady despite the rising tension around them, and told her that the drive was very likely sitting in that very compartment right now, waiting for someone to come and reclaim it before the 20 minutes ran out. The train shuddered as it cut through a mountainous stretch of track, the whole car swaying with enough force that Amelia had to grip the corridor rail to keep her footing as Elijah led her toward the baggage compartment at the rear of the train. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, checking each connecting door before opening it, listening for footsteps ahead of them, pausing once to let a maintenance worker pass without acknowledging them at all. Amelia followed close behind, her heart pounding, aware that every minute brought them closer to Mason's deadline and closer, she hoped, to reclaiming the evidence that could end his reign over the company for good. When they reached the baggage car, they found the door already cracked open, and through the gap Elijah spotted the same tired attendant from the dining counter passing something small and rectangular into the waiting hand of Jason Reed. Elijah pulled Amelia back against the wall before either man could notice them, his mind already working through the geometry of the narrow space, the exits, the angles that would let them retrieve the drive without triggering a confrontation that could turn violent in such a confined area. He murmured a quick plan into her ear, low and steady. And for the first time that night, Amelia found herself moving not as someone being protected, but as someone actively taking part in her own rescue. She stepped forward first, feigning disorientation, asking loudly whether this was the way to the restroom, drawing Jason's attention just long enough for Elijah to slip behind the stacked luggage and lift the drive from an open duffel bag resting near his feet. It was a small, precise theft executed in under 4 seconds, and by the time Jason turned back toward the sound of Amelia's voice, the object he had just received had already vanished from view. Logan appeared then, stepping into the doorway behind them, his earlier contempt replaced by something sharper and more alert, now that he sensed the situation slipping away from his control. He blocked the exit, forcing Elijah into a confrontation neither of them could avoid any longer. What followed lasted only seconds, a controlled sequence of movement so economical that it barely resembled a fight at all. Elijah redirecting Logan's weight against the luggage rack and pinning his arm just long enough to remove any leverage, never striking harder than necessary, never losing the composure that had defined him since the moment Amelia first whispered her desperate request beside him. With Logan subdued and the corridor briefly clear, Amelia took the drive from Elijah's hand, her fingers trembling with adrenaline rather than fear now. She opened the small case attached to it and noticed, tucked behind the primary files, an additional folder she did not recognize, one labeled with a case number rather than a name. Curious, despite the danger still surrounding them, she opened it and found herself staring at old federal documents bearing Elijah's name, the very files connected to the internal investigation that had ended his career years earlier. Amelia looked up at him, stunned, then back down at the documents, tracing the names listed as overseeing the original case. One name appeared twice, buried in the fine print of an internal memo authorizing the falsified reports that destroyed Elijah's reputation. It was Mason Drake. The realization moved through Amelia like a current, reshaping everything she thought she understood about the night. This was never simply a matter of corporate theft and a hurried escape toward Washington. Somehow, in a way neither of them could have predicted when the train pulled out of the station, her fight and Elijah's long-buried past had been tangled together from the very beginning. Amelia stared at the documents in her hands, piecing together a truth that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Mason had not simply chosen this train because it offered a convenient, isolated stretch of track far from her usual security detail. He had chosen it because he already knew who traveled on it. For years, it seemed, he had kept tabs on Elijah, quietly monitoring the man whose old investigation could resurface at any moment and expose the very corruption Mason had built his career on burying. Placing Amelia on this train, whether by design or by a fortunate accident from his perspective, had given him an opportunity he could not have planned better himself. A chance to draw Elijah back into the light and eliminate the threat both of them now posed to him at once. Elijah's jaw tightened as the pieces settled into place, though his voice remained level when he finally spoke. He said quietly that this had stopped being only Amelia's fight the moment Mason's name appeared in that file, that whatever happened for the rest of the night now belonged to both of them equally. Amelia searched his face for any sign of resentment, any flicker of regret at being pulled back into a nightmare he had spent years trying to leave behind, but found only a steady, unwavering resolve that surprised her more than anger would have. She asked him gently whether helping her meant risking the quiet, careful life he had rebuilt for himself and his daughter, the anonymity that had let him raise her far from the wreckage of his old career. Elijah considered the question seriously before answering, his eyes distant for a moment as though weighing every year of hard-won peace against what stood in front of him now. He told her that peace built on silence was not the same as peace built on truth, and that he had spent long enough letting Mason's lies define the shape of his life. Quiet, he said, was not the same as safe. Not really. Not when the person responsible for ruining you was still out there ruining others. Before either of them could say more, the lights along their section of the car flickered and dimmed, the hum of the train's electrical system faltering in a way that felt anything but accidental. Somewhere ahead, Carter and Jason had clearly cut power to a portion of the car, plunging the corridor into an uneven half-darkness meant to disorient anyone still resisting them. Passengers nearby began murmuring in confusion, a few rising uncertainly from their seats, unsure whether the disruption was mechanical or something far more deliberate. Amelia felt the tension in the air sharpen, the fragile normalcy of the earlier hours completely gone now, replaced by something closer to open conflict. She gripped the recovered drive tightly against her chest, aware of how much now depended on getting it safely to Washington intact. Elijah positioned himself slightly in front of her, scanning the dim corridor for movement, his calm expression settling into something harder, more focused, the expression of a man preparing for confrontation rather than avoiding it. Then, through the train's internal speaker system, a distorted announcement crackled to life, Mason's voice unmistakable even through the static, informing any nearby staff and passengers that a woman matching Amelia's description was considered a serious security risk and should be detained immediately upon identification. The announcement ended as abruptly as it began, leaving a stunned, uncertain silence behind it. Amelia felt every eye in the dim corridor turn briefly toward her, and for the first time that night, she understood that Mason intended to turn the very people around her into an unwitting extension of his trap. Elijah understood immediately that the announcement had changed the nature of the danger surrounding them. It was no longer simply 3 men against 2 passengers. It was 3 men who could now count on the confusion of an entire train car working in their favor, ordinary travelers who might, out of fear or misplaced civic duty, try to restrain Amelia themselves before anyone understood the truth of what was happening. He needed to protect her without letting a single frightened bystander become collateral damage in a fight that had nothing to do with them. He guided Amelia quickly toward a service alcove near the rear of the car, pulling a small backup radio panel from beneath a maintenance hatch, a relic of his old training that most passengers would never recognize as anything other than decorative equipment. Using a frequency he still remembered from years earlier, he sent a brief, coded signal out into the night, hoping against long odds that it would reach someone who might still recognize it, an old colleague who had once trusted him completely before the department turned its back on them both. Amelia watched him work, her mind racing through her own limited options. She could attempt to slip off the train at the next unscheduled stop, disappearing into the darkness of some rural platform, and hoping to find safety on her own terms. Or she could continue forward into Washington, directly into the meeting that had been the entire point of this journey, gambling that the review board's presence might offer enough protection once she arrived. Elijah, sensing her hesitation, told her plainly that running now would only delay the inevitable. Mason had shown, more than once tonight, that his reach extended further than a single train car. The only way to end this permanently was to walk directly into the light rather than away from it. Their tentative plan fractured almost immediately when the train began to slow through a curve, and Carter Wells moved into position near the connecting door ahead of them, a hard, purposeful look replacing his earlier smugness. Elijah pulled Amelia back through the narrow passage toward the next car, weaving quickly between startled passengers, buying precious seconds as the train's reduced speed made the corridor feel even more claustrophobic than before. A brief, tense chase unfolded through two connecting cars, Carter closing the distance more than once before Elijah managed to redirect him into a service door, buying just enough separation to keep moving forward. At the edge of the dining car, a man in a hastily assembled uniform stepped directly into Amelia's path, flashing a badge and announcing himself as transit security, his tone commanding immediate compliance. For a fraction of a second, Amelia nearly obeyed out of pure instinct, the automatic deference most people offer to any authority that presents itself with enough confidence. Elijah, however, caught the subtle imperfection in the badge instantly, the wrong font, the slightly outdated seal, details that would have escaped almost anyone else's notice in a moment of panic. He pulled her sharply away just before the man's hand could close around her arm, and the imposter's mask of authority cracked into open aggression. Amelia, breathless and shaking, turned to the handful of passengers who had gathered nearby watching the commotion unfold, and made a decision that surprised even herself. In a clear, unwavering voice, she told them plainly who she was and why she was being pursued, explaining that she carried evidence of corporate corruption that powerful people wanted buried before it ever reached the authorities. The passengers exchanged uncertain glances at first, but something in her steady, unflinching honesty began to shift the atmosphere of the car. One by one, they started to move, not toward her captors, but toward her, forming an unplanned protective barrier that Mason's men had not accounted for at all. Somewhere beyond the reach of the train's dimmed lights, Elijah's old signal had finally found its intended target. Samuel Brooks, a former colleague who had once worked alongside him during his years as a federal investigator, picked up the coded transmission from a monitoring station he still maintained out of old habit, more sentiment than necessity. Recognizing the pattern immediately, Samuel began working to access the train's onboard camera network remotely, calling in a favor from a contact at the rail authority to bypass the usual security protocols in a matter of minutes rather than hours. Back inside the car, Elijah guided Amelia to a quiet corner near the service alcove and instructed her to open the hidden folder buried within the recovered data drive, the one containing the original files tied to his old case alongside the newer evidence of Mason's financial theft. Amelia worked quickly, her hands steadier now than they had been at any point that night, paging through documents that painted an unmistakable picture of a man who had spent years protecting his own interests by destroying anyone who threatened them. Rather than wait for the review board meeting scheduled for the following morning, Amelia made a decision that surprised even Elijah. She activated her company's emergency communication pathway, a system normally reserved for crisis announcements to shareholders and senior staff, and began recording a direct message meant to be delivered the moment she regained a stable connection. Her voice, though tired, carried none of the hesitation it might have hours earlier. She explained calmly and clearly what she had discovered, laying out the evidence against Mason Drake in plain, unembellished terms. Her phone rang again, almost immediately afterward, Mason's name flashing once more across the screen, his tone this time stripped of any earlier smoothness, replaced instead by open threat. He warned her that releasing anything prematurely would destroy her credibility as thoroughly as it would his, that he still had resources and allies willing to bury her reputation alongside her career. Amelia, for the first time all night, felt no tremor of fear in response. She told him plainly that she was no longer facing this alone, and introduced, for the benefit of anyone who might later review the recording, the man who had helped her survive the night, Elijah Carter, a name Mason clearly recognized far too well. Elijah, though visibly uncomfortable being named at all, did not stop her. He understood, perhaps better than she did in that moment, that the truth about his own case deserved the same daylight she was giving to hers. As Amelia continued speaking, the recovered documents from his old investigation became part of the same broadcast, exposing not only Mason's theft of research funds, but the years-old cover-up that had cost an innocent man his career and his reputation. Outside their small alcove, the three men, sensing their plan collapsing in real time, abandoned any pretense of subtlety. Logan and Jason moved together toward Amelia's position, no longer concerned with maintaining the appearance of ordinary passengers, while Carter attempted to seize the recording device directly from her hands. Elijah stepped between them without hesitation, positioning himself firmly in their path, calm but immovable, drawing the attention of dozens of passengers who had gathered nearby, phones raised, capturing everything unfolding in front of them as unshakable, undeniable witnesses. As the confrontation reached its peak, the train's brakes engaged with a long, echoing groan, easing its speed as the lights of Washington finally appeared in the distance. Ahead, faint and growing steadily louder, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night, a sound that told everyone inside that car, guilty and innocent alike, that whatever happened next would no longer take place in the shadows. The train rolled to a final stop inside the station in Washington, its platform already lined with federal agents and local officers who had mobilized the moment Amelia's broadcast reached the right desks. Bright lights flooded the arriving cars, and for a moment the entire scene felt almost unreal to Amelia, the quiet desperation of the last 3 hours suddenly spilling out into full public view under the harsh glow of official response. Mason Drake arrived at the station shortly after, accompanied by a personal attorney and a carefully composed expression meant to project the calm confidence of a man who believed he could still talk his way out of anything. He attempted to frame himself as a concerned executive blindsided by a chaotic, dangerous night, insisting he had no knowledge of any criminal activity aboard the train. Amelia, standing steady despite her exhaustion, handed the recovered drive, along with a secondary backup copy, directly to the lead investigator, ensuring that nothing about the evidence could be dismissed as circumstantial or convenient timing. Samuel Brooks arrived soon after, confirming publicly what Elijah had spent years unable to prove on his own, that the internal investigation which destroyed his career had been built on falsified reports authorized under Mason's direction. Officers moved quickly to formally reopen the old case, and for the first time in years, Elijah watched as the record that had defined his reputation for so long finally began to unravel in his favor rather than against him. Logan, Carter, and Jason were taken into custody directly on the platform, their earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by the flat, resigned silence of men who understood exactly how much evidence now worked against them. Mason, cornered by the sheer weight of testimony and documentation surrounding him, made one last attempt to diminish Elijah in front of the gathering crowd, sneering that he was nothing more than a struggling single father who had simply gotten lucky, someone Amelia pitied rather than respect. Amelia turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, her voice carrying clearly across the platform without hesitation. She told them plainly that Elijah did not need her pity, and had never needed it. He was the reason she was standing there at all, the reason the evidence had survived the night, the reason a company built by her father would not collapse under the weight of one man's greed. Elijah said nothing in response, but something in his posture eased slightly, an old wound she could not fully see beginning, quietly, to close. She knew she still had to walk directly into the review board meeting, waiting for her inside the building ahead, the very meeting this entire night had been building toward. But before she turned to go, she reached for the small, plain ring she had bought in a moment of desperation. From a vending display in the dining car hours earlier, the improvised prop of a marriage that had never been real. She pressed it gently into Elijah's palm, closing his fingers around it. She told him simply that their 3 hours were over now, but she did not want whatever gratitude she owed him to end there on that platform, with sirens still flashing and reporters already gathering at the edges of the scene. Elijah looked down at the small ring in his hand, then back up at her, and for the first time since the train had pulled out of New York, something in his expression softened into an emotion neither of them had expected to find at the end of such a dangerous night. In the weeks that followed, Mason Drake was formally charged with fraud and obstruction. The mountain of evidence Amelia had carried through that long, dangerous night proving more than sufficient to end both his career and a single stroke. The board of Langford Biotech underwent a quiet but thorough restructuring, several members who had quietly supported Mason's schemes stepping down before investigators could examine their own conduct too closely. Amelia remained at the head of the company, but something about the way she led it changed in the aftermath of that night. She stopped carrying every burden alone, began building a smaller circle of people she genuinely trusted, and found herself far less willing to dismiss quiet, unassuming people the way she once might have dismissed a stranger in a worn jacket sitting beside her on a train. The lesson had cost her nearly everything in the span of 3 hours, and she had no intention of forgetting it. Elijah, meanwhile, found his name formally cleared, the falsified records from years earlier expunged from his file entirely. His old department extended an offer to return, a full reinstatement with back pay, and an apology that came far too late to undo everything the years of silence had cost him. He considered it seriously, weighing the pull of a career he had once loved against the quiet, careful life he had built for the sake of his daughter, a life that had given her stability even when it gave him almost nothing else. One brief phone call, warm and unhurried, reminded him gently of exactly what mattered most as he made his decision, and he found himself smiling in a way he had not allowed himself in years. Weeks later, Amelia traveled to a small, quiet station outside the city, arriving without an entourage, without security, without the practiced armor she wore into every boardroom. She found Elijah waiting near the platform, dressed simply, his posture relaxed in a way it had never been on the night they met. She thanked him again, not simply for the danger he had helped her survive, but for something far more lasting, the reminder that trusting another person was not automatically a weakness waiting to be exploited. Elijah admitted quietly that before that night, he had come to believe his life was little more than a series of trains passing through stations that led nowhere in particular, each day much like the last, defined by caution rather than possibility. Amelia offered a small, genuine smile, telling him that perhaps, in the strangest way imaginable, that particular train had carried them both exactly where they needed to go after all. Neither of them rushed toward grand declarations or promises of a perfect future together. What began between them instead was something steadier, built first on respect, earned under real pressure, then on the kind of trust that cannot be manufactured or performed, however convincing an act might be for 3 hours on a moving train. It grew slowly, over quiet dinners and unhurried conversations, over the small, ordinary moments neither of them had allowed themselves in years. The story closed as it had begun, with the two of them standing near a platform, though this time there were no strangers watching, no hidden danger lurking at the edges of the scene, no desperate whispered plea required to bring them together. Elijah and Amelia stood side by side as the early light of dawn spread slowly across the tracks, no longer playing the roles of husband and wife, yet no longer strangers either, simply two people who had found, in the unlikeliest possible circumstances, something worth holding on to.